Recently I've been playing Dark Souls 3 again over on my Twitch channel. Quite a lot of it actually. I've been delving into invasions again, not taking them seriously and just trying to have fun, and I'm having a blast honestly. I actually get the urge to play Dark Souls 3 again, which is fantastic, and before we delve into today's topic, if you do want to get involved in the conversation and watch some invasions, we've got some really nice people over on my Twitch, so if you've got the time, be sure to stop by. But anyway, a topic that gets brought up a lot is the Covenants in Dark Souls 3, and just how, well, lackluster they actually are. Now we're going to be focusing on specifically Dark Souls 3 Covenants, and only using comparisons to the other Souls games where they seem fit. But firstly I want to say, we can all agree the Covenants, especially in Dark Souls 3, feel, well, a little lacking, right? It feels as though they've lost their identity and were a massive afterthought, with no real focus on how each Covenant is portrayed in the game. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to go through each Covenant and we'll try and give it a purpose. Now please bear in mind I'm not an expert game designer, the stuff we're going to talk about is merely quote-unquote shower thoughts, with no real thought into technicality or anything like that. I'm just trying to diverse the Covenants by adding unique concepts to them so they'll hopefully sound appealing for the right reasons. Now, the reason for doing this is I don't want to see this trend continue into the Souls-like games that lie ahead of us. Bloodborne's Covenants again were lacking, and that had very little impact on the game, and I don't feel that should be the case. I want the Covenants to have some brand loyalty and for them to have a bigger impact on the world around us. But not only are we going to get into how they changed the world, but what would happen if you were to choose said Covenant? How would it affect your character? And again, these are just some random thoughts where I was thinking, yeah, that sounds pretty cool, so don't take this too seriously. So without further ado, let's get into it. Firstly, let's cover the Way of Blue Covenant. In the base game, you equip this Covenant, and if you get invaded, it allows Blades of the Darkmoon and Blue Sentinels to get auto-summoned into your world to help you deal with the invader. Now, the idea of this is to differentiate the Covenants from each other and make them unique. So let's take a look at some stuff. At the moment, there's no negative aspect to equipping this Covenant item, and I don't think that's a good thing. I feel as though there needs to be repercussions if you're going to be able to have outside help when dealing with invaders. So, what did I have in mind? Well, in Dark Souls 3, there's not a single Covenant that affects the single player experience, so why not take Way of Blue and just expand on it for both the single player and multiplayer experience? So I thought of this. When the Way of Blue is equipped, you gain the trait Curse of Ash, which makes enemies deal up to 20% more damage and have 10% more health, and removes the ability to summon phantoms. This adds some repercussions to the Covenant whilst adding some elements to the PvE side of the game, just like the Company of Champions in Dark Souls 2. Now, will this limit users of the item and thus limit Blue, Sentinels and Darkmoon summons? Well, in its current state in the base game, yes it would. But we'll move on to the summon mechanics when we get to those Covenants. But to counter that, we need to add benefits to the Way of Blue, alongside having the ability to have Darkmoons and Blue Sentinels help with invasions, but more so incentive to keep it on. So with that comes rewards. What rewards? Really doesn't matter as long as they're there. But how do Way of Blue go about obtaining said rewards? Well, that's kind of the difficult thing to answer, because if we say you need to kill your invader, that's not really different from every other Covenant in the game. So I kind of had this idea to shift Way of Blue to primarily focus on the PvE. With the Covenant changing the numbers of the enemies, I thought you could get rewarded for killing a boss whilst within the Way of Blue. And because there'll be no phantoms, it would be a real test for the player, and in turn, should be rewarded for it. Next, I want to talk about Warriors of Sunlight. Firstly, I don't particularly like the fact Warriors of Sunlight can invade hosts. When I think of Sunbros, I think of the famous Jolly Cooperation, which is, or was, a fundamental part of what the Warriors of Sunlight Covenant was, giving the group an identity. So if it were me, I'd remove the ability for Warriors of Sun to invade, and making it so, to reap the Covenant rewards, you'd get them by helping a host defeat the boss, just like in the previous iterations. I think in turn this would boost the random signs appearing before bosses or at bonfires, and ensure co-op remains prevalent throughout the game. In the game's current state, it's a lot easier for someone to invade as a Sunbro to gain the rewards, but with the removal of this, again, I think it would promote co-op, especially random signs. But this so far is just reverting back to how Warriors of Sunlight performed in previous titles, so what can we change in the Covenant to make it a little bit more unique? In Dark Souls 2, when joining the Warriors of Sunlight, you receive a ring called the Sun Seal, which increased power of miracles by 5%. So if we take this concept and apply it to Dark Souls 3, when the Warriors of the Sun get summoned to take part in online play, they gain the trait Seeker of Sun, which grants them 2 perks. The first being a 5% miracle power increase. To me, Warriors of Sunlight have always been associated to miracle and the gods, and again it gives the Covenant a deeper purpose with what we'll go into in a second, and keeps in with the tradition of what a Sunlight Covenant is all about. The second perk is when a Warrior of Sun is in a host's world, the host is granted the Hand of Light perk. Now this seems like a little powerful, but I think if it was tuned correctly it could work quite well. So when a Sunbro is in the vicinity, it grants the host a 5% physical damage absorption rating. This could affect both the host and the Sunbro, but they'd have to be in close proximity of one another for this to be active. Again, this gives the Covenant a sense of identity, helping the host and protecting them instead of just being a glorified white phantom. These perks could be obtained by progressing through the tiers of rewards. If you have a high level Warrior of Sunlight, the damage absorption perk could be higher, or the miracle power buff could be higher. This coupled with the glorious glow getting brighter and brighter as you progress through the ranks, not only giving you a cosmetic reward, but a useful one to help in future ventures into jolly cooperation. Now on to Rosarias Fingers. Now because this is a PvP focused Covenant which isn't really different from the previous games, I don't think I'd change much about it regarding perks and whatnot. When it comes to invaders, you should always be at a disadvantage. That goes without saying. So instead of discussing perks, I'm going to talk about some changes I'd like to see in the PvP element with invasions specifically. It's fairly simple really. If a host gets invaded, they can't summon until the invader has been dealt with. If a summoned phantom or phantoms are already in the world, these are obviously not affected. But if they die, they can't be summoned back, and new phantoms cannot be brought into the world until the invader dies. Now this does not affect Blue Sentinels and Blade of the Darkmoon, but we'll get onto how they're brought into the world soon. Now to incentivize Rosarias Fingers, besides from invasions are fun, you'll be granted a cosmetic reward. And to gain these rewards, it's similar to how Dark Souls 2 worked. Let's say for example, the reward tiers are 50, 150, and 500 kills. Now when I say kills, I mean actual kills. For example, if a host has 3 people in their world, 2 phantoms and 1 host, and the Rosarias Finger wins, that counts as 3 kills. If a Rosarias Finger were to lose the invasion, it would then count as a loss. So again, let's say you gain 3 kills and win an invasion. You now have 3 points. Now, let's say, in the second invasion you lose, then you would lose a point and go back down to 2. I really like this. It incentivizes the continuation of play, but a flaw that Dark Souls has is keeping track of how many points you actually have in a Covenant. So I think for ease of use, how many points a Rosarias Finger has should be updated in real time and viewable at Rosaria herself. Now moving on to the rewards, perhaps reskinned weapons at the various tiers, or like the Warriors of Sun Covenant we talked about earlier, we should incorporate a distinct change to the way the aura appears, just like in Dark Souls 2. Now the Mound Makers have the potential to be really interesting, but it also has the potential to just make no sense whatsoever. In the base game they acted as this wild card, but as the game's life got older and older you started to see less and less purple white signs, because hosts just weren't picking them up, because the majority just ended up trying to kill them. So I'd want to focus on this Covenant having longevity instead of relying on clueless first time players. The change I'd make to Mound Makers is to have them have a certain timed RNG aspect to them. Mound Makers can no longer place white signs, instead they primarily invade, but upon entering a host's world they get one of 2 messages. Kill the host to achieve victory, or aid the host to achieve victory. But we need to have that element of wildness and uncertainty for the host that changes each time they're invaded, because now in the base game 9 times out of 10 Mound Makers will just aim for the host to achieve victory, again not giving the Covenant a true diverse identity. So perhaps we could add something like this. When a Mound Maker invades a host, they get one of 2 messages, right? This is what we've established so far. Now the Mound Maker is on a time limit. The longer a Mound Maker stays in the world, the higher the reward. This applies for both the kill or aid scenario, depending on which is given to them. But the host can hurt you, and you can hurt the host, even if your objective is to aid them. So let's say, for example, you invade a host who's just started an area. You gain their trust and manage to go through the entire level and help kill the boss with the host. You'll be granted a big reward, because you stayed in the world for a long time and you completed your objective. Let's say you get X amount of Mound Maker rewards for time spent in the world. Now let's flip it. Let's say you invade a host at the start of the area, but your objective is to kill them. If you want to gain the max amount of rewards, you'd have to gain the host trust, just like before, but let's say you gain the trust, you both enter the boss room, and then you kill them in the boss room, betraying them, and gaining the rewards. But I want to go further than that with the Mound Makers. I want them to have a big impact on the world because I feel as though they have the potential to do so. So as time in the host world goes up, your mere presence starts to infect the world with purple versions of random enemy mobs in random places, but with a huge aggro range. Not only that, but existing enemies, because with a wildcard, will randomly turn on their counterparts for a brief moment, almost as if they're under the spell rapport. The whole idea behind a Mound Maker is an unstable invader, but still wanting to gain the trust of others to achieve their goal. But what's to stop the host from just killing you outright to not deal with you? Well, that's, and I know we're bringing this word up a lot, but we need to incentivize hosts to want Mound Makers in their world. But how do you go about doing that? Perhaps, whilst a Mound Maker is in your world, a host's item discovery goes up by a lot. Let's say 200 points. The host can gain more souls for kills, and maybe from the infected purple enemies that the Mound Makers spawn, the Mound Maker Covenant item can also drop for the hosts. This is key here. As we mentioned before, the whole gimmick of the Mound Makers dwindled down as there were less new players to take advantage of. With this, I feel it'll keep that element active throughout every single invasion. My only fear is perhaps this might be too convoluted to work. The Mound Maker is currently, I feel, the most advanced Covenant in the base game, but lacks focus on longevity. With something like this, I feel I'd love to go in there, start infecting worlds, and gaining the trust of hosts. Now, Blades of the Darkmoon are in a weird state right now in the game. Previously, you could not get summoned whatsoever, with wait times being literally hours long. We're now at a point in the game where Blades of the Darkmoon, alongside the Blue Sentinels, get summoned in constantly if the host has the Way of Blue equipped, with refresh timers as low as 2 minutes. Now, like I mentioned earlier, with the way summons should work in a host world, if we were to recap, when an invader invades a host world, the host can no longer summon anyone until the invader has been dealt with. Now, for this to work in the way I'd like it to, we'd have to reintroduce the guilty system. Let's say after 15 points as a Rosarias Finger, and remember points is per kill and not per win, they are now classed as guilty. So Blades of the Darkmoon no longer get summoned to a host world if they are being invaded. We're completely scrapping that side of the Covenant. Instead, they'll get their blue orb back, and will actively invade members of the guilty in their own world. Pretty much how it exactly worked in Dark Souls 1 and 2. So how can we alter it in Dark Souls 3, but keep the fundamental aspects that make this Covenant unique from the rest? Let's give it a go. I feel as though if a Rosarias Finger has gained 15 points, they should be familiar enough with the PvP aspect to take on multiple foes. So we'll limit how many blades can be in a guilty host's world to 2, and Blades of the Darkmoon, when taking part in eradicating the guilty, will be granted the trait Seeker of the Moon, which gives you an additional 5 points in intelligence and increases moonlight damage by 15%. Now again, let me just reiterate this obviously wouldn't affect everyone, but it gives the Covenant identity, keeping in line with the lore. A big issue with this Covenant is how the rewards were handed out. Again, we could use the point system we used for the Warriors of Sunlight. A host and Aldrich Faithful could be worth 2 points, or Concord Keps, and if a host as a phantom, they could be worth a point apiece. But the major factor here is fundamentally fixing the way the mechanics of the invasion play out. Having 5 auto-summoned Covenants with 2 bearing no difference to one another just isn't fun. And yes, this is basically just reverting Darkmoons to how they used to be, but that's fine in this scenario, because that system just worked. I don't want to make this video too long, so join us next time when we'll cover the remainder of the Covenants. So make sure to subscribe so you get notified of that. I've been Paragon, take care everyone.